discussed earlier, that is based in a locale that may have less regulatory guidelines, may have less aggressive law enforcement. So that is a distinction I think needs made. Is the virtual currency within the existing laws? I believe there are plenty of opportunities for digital currencies to operate within the existing laws and regulations. And as far as the Secret Service investigations are concerned, as long as they fit within the laws and they comply with existing FinCEN guidance, then there would be no violation, no reason for the Secret Service to look into it.
All right. Ms. Raman, would you respond to the same question, especially the second half of the question, which agencies do you believe need to be at the forefront of the federal government's work on virtual currencies?
Starting with that question then first, I think the Department of Justice recognized a few years ago that a joint effort was needed, and the FBI set up and led the Virtual Currency Emerging Threats Working Group, which is now the working group that my colleagues here and many other agencies participate in. It's borne out to be very fruitful. It's a forum that allows all of the agencies that you'd want to be at the table, the Treasury Department, our law enforcement agencies, even within the Department of Justice, the FBI, DEA, and other agencies within the Department of Justice's prosecutors. We have U.S. attorneys' offices and two sections of the criminal division, the asset forfeiture and money laundering section, and the computer crime and intellectual property section participating. OFAC, IRS, and a number of other agencies here in the United States that we think are necessary participants are in fact participants. We also have foreign law enforcement that participates in that group, including the National Crime Agency in the UK. And these are, I think, the most important agencies to be at the table. That covers the waterfront in terms of regulations and regulatory enforcement and criminal law enforcement. There's, of course, room for improvement, and we're always looking for additional participants. And even, in fact, last week, there were additional participants that were invited to join that working group. I think it's an excellent...
Well, from other countries or from within this country?
I think, well, both, but even last week, we thought of an additional domestic agency that should be at the table, and we've invited them to participate. And so I think it's going to be an evolving process. It's proven so helpful thus far, and I think we are intending for that to continue to be an important forum in which we can talk jointly about what the emerging threats are, what each of our agencies can do to coordinate across the government, both here and abroad. As for the regulations and the laws that cover virtual currencies, I feel confident that currently our criminal statutes that we have used in our prosecutions thus far have been effective tools. Our money laundering statutes have been very effective in our ability to prosecute e-gold, Liberty Reserve, for example. Our substantive criminal statutes, such as our drug trafficking statutes and murder statutes, have been effective thus far in being able to charge the administrator of Silk Road. And our money transmitter statutes, which is 18 U.S.C. 1960, has also been used to prosecute Liberty Reserve and some of its principals, for example. And so I do think that we have the statutory tools for the most part that we as prosecutors need to get at this kind of criminal activity. But I will say that the Department of Justice over the last few years has been proposing and pushing updates to our money laundering statutes through the Proceeds of Crime Act and related pieces of legislation. And those changes are ones that we continue to support. Money laundering statutes have been on the books for a long time, and they've been effective, but they can be updated. And we've proposed over the years several updates that we continue to support.
Shasky?
Sure, taking the questions in turn. FinCEN has never opined and still is not opining on whether virtual currency is a real currency or a commodity, as those questions are outside of our purview. We are the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regulator for the federal government, and so our regulations spoke to that and only that, and we tried to make that clear in our guidance this last March. But this country, like all countries, has an interest not only in protecting our financial system from money laundering and terrorist finance, but also protecting consumers from fraud, collecting taxes, protecting investors, ensuring economic stability, all things that are a part of our regulatory system but outside of the purview of FinCEN. And so to the extent that this body or others feel that it's appropriate to take those considerations into account with regard to virtual currency, we would look forward to working with them to make sure we're as coordinated as possible in our actions.
All right, thank you. You all know about the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and one of the, most people, I guess a lot of people in this country have heard them, most people probably have no idea what GAO is or what they do, but they're, as we know, a watchdog, and they're sort of the congressional watchdog to make sure that we're minding our P's and Q's in the federal government in a lot of different ways. The way we run our operations, trying to do it in a cost-effective way, broad operations, widely diverse operations. Every other year, GAO comes up with something they call their high-risk list. And when I first heard about the high-risk list, I said, what is that? And they said it's a high-risk list is a whole list of activities designated by, identified by General Accountability Office to waste money. Every now and then I talk to constituents, we talk about what we're doing to try to reduce the budget deficit. And I have people say, I don't want to pay any more taxes, but if I'm going to, I just don't want you to waste my money. And one of the things that GAO does, working with the Congress, is to identify ways to spend money more effectively, and also to collect monies that are owed to the Treasury more effectively. And it's that second half of that function I want to talk about. The GAO every other year reports to us, along with the help of the IRS, on something called tax gap. Monies that are owed, hundreds of billions of dollars that are owed to the Treasury, but they're not being collected. In some cases, we have a pretty good idea who owes the money, the entities that owe the money. But it's a lot of money that goes uncollected. And I'd like to say that number is going down, but unfortunately, to my knowledge, it isn't, at least not just. But what I want to do is, with that as background, just ask you when I think about the new types of currencies, I wonder how they fit in to the tax system here in our country. And as you know, we just talked about it, GAO, but they issued a report, I think it was early this year, maybe it was May of this year, in which follows my line of thinking and assesses that virtual currencies could present a real vulnerability and actually make worse what is already a difficult situation. They recommended that the IRS find relatively low-cost ways to provide guidance to taxpayers on the basic tax reporting requirements for virtual currencies. And let me just ask, do you know the current status of that guidance? And what could we expect it to include, and when can we expect it to be released? And I would say either Ms. Shasky or Mr. Raman, if you could tackle that one, I'd be grateful.
I'd be happy to begin with that one. So first of all, as the Financial Intelligence Unit for the United States, one thing FinCEN does after it collects all of the information that our financial institutions provide to us is we make that available to our partners in law enforcement, not only for the purpose of enforcing our criminal laws, but also for the collection of taxes. And so we have a very close and long-standing relationship with the IRS, both on the criminal side and the civil side, to help them do just that. In fact, this very last week, we were meeting with them on this very topic, virtual currencies, and how to think of that in our joint work. Something that I know they're taking very seriously. When it comes to guidance on virtual currency for taxpayers, I know there was the GAO report that suggested that IRS come out with some guidance, because there may perhaps be some question as to how to treat different uses of virtual currency for purposes of our taxing regime. And while I don't know the details and would have to refer you to IRS to get into great detail, what I can tell you, and I do know, is that they are working diligently on such guidance, and that...
Any idea when we might expect to see it?
My understanding is that the GAO report may have set forth some deadlines. I think it's usually 60 to 90 days. I can tell you they're actively working on it, and it's at the forefront of their minds. I think it'll be very useful guidance for the taxpayers when it comes out.
Ms. Raman, do you want to add or take away anything from what Ms. Shasky said?
Certainly not take away anything. I defer to the IRS on the status of the guidance, and I am not personally aware of the status of the guidance. I will say that the Department of Justice was very aware of the GAO report. We took an interest in its findings, and we've been in discussions with the IRS about some of the findings in the GAO report.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Shasky, I think you said earlier, you might have said earlier, that FinCEN did not opine on whether or not virtual currencies are currencies or commodities. And I would just ask of you, who do you think should be making that decision? And second question would be, beyond who do you think should be making that decision, do we need that definition to be made in order to enforce the laws and regulations?
I'm not sure I know who should ultimately make that decision. I do know it's outside of the...
Do you think it should be Mr. Lowery over?
I'm guessing it should not be Mr. Lowery. In terms of the legality of various things, I'm sure that Congress has a role in determining that. When we start talking about commodities, the CFTC comes to mind. When we talk about securities, the SEC. Regardless of who should be making those determinations, our focus at FinCEN was, we know that virtual currency currently exists. We know that it is being used to transact payments. We know that it has been exploited by some pretty serious criminal organizations, and we want to protect the U.S. financial system, as we're mandated to do, from those illicit actors, from laundering or moving money for the purposes of terrorism through our U.S. financial system. And so our entire focus has been on how can we best do that under our current regulatory scheme. The nice thing is that the regulatory scheme that we have in place has the flexibility in it to change as the landscape changes. So in other words, if some part of the industry were to ultimately be defined to come under the SEC or the CFTC, our AML, our anti-money laundering regulations also apply to those areas of the industry. And so regardless, we're going to make sure that we're taking every mitigating step we can to prevent illicit actors from operating through the U.S. financial system.
Okay. Mr. Lowery, let me focus a question on you, and maybe, if you like, Ms. Raman. As I think you're both probably aware, a few weeks after the Silk Road website was taken down by federal law enforcement, a new Silk Road website popped up in its place. And it's hardly alone. Numerous other similar marketplaces exist on the dark web, selling drugs, selling weapons, selling child pornography, and in some cases market for higher services. Whether or not these are real marketplaces or simply some scam artist's idea of a sick joke, it obviously makes people worried. It makes people concerned. How do we develop a strategy? How do we develop a strategy to deal with these sites? And are there particular characteristics of these sites that make it more difficult for law enforcement to respond? Would you respond to that, Mr. Lowery, and then maybe Ms. Raman?
Absolutely. So the online sites, the Secret Service in our investigations, once again, we believe there are three infrastructures in place that facilitate the online crimes. The Silk Road type criminal forums. One of the Secret Service specialties are on the criminal forums, Eastern European based predominantly, that specialize in the large-scale trafficking of stolen financial data and what have you. So there are other of these websites that specialize in specific crimes. The other part of the infrastructure is the digital currencies, the use of digital currencies, predominantly the digital currencies that fall outside of the guidance of FinCEN or outside of U.S. law, or in countries that obviously, as I said earlier, have less regulatory controls. And the third is what we call we refer to as bulletproof hosters.
Referred to as what?
Bulletproof hosting. It's a criminal organization, a criminal individual who specifically sets up business in a country with very little regulatory or aggressive law enforcement and provides a platform for attacks to be launched against the U.S. criminal infrastructure. So the Secret Service attacks the problem strategically. We are always looking to identify the individual behind a specific crime, the intruder, the large-scale vendor of stolen personal data, or what have you. And at times it may be that if we can identify a forum or a digital currency that is within legal reach, within reach of U.S. law enforcement, case in point, Liberty Reserve or e-gold, then it makes strategic sense to take that out of the equation. And it disrupts the criminal organization for strategic reasons, quite honestly, usually to facilitate the arrest of other individuals we're looking at.
All right, thank you. Ms. Raman, you want to add anything to that statement?
I think the challenge that you're pointing to sometimes really results from anonymity, and it results from many criminals migrating to hidden services on the internet.
Migrating to what?
To hidden services on the internet. And that has been a challenge for law enforcement, but as you've seen from the results that have that we've been able to achieve in the last several years, I think we've been able to keep pace with that, and we've been able to develop tools and strategies to address it. Although it is, I think, as you mentioned, it can be frustrating to the public to see another website pop up after one that seems similar to it just having been taken down. I do think, as Mr. Lowery said, that it's incredibly important for us to be taking those steps, not just to disrupt that particular organization, but to send a message to the users of those websites that that they cannot trust those types of websites, that law enforcement is watching, and it is not, in fact, anonymous, and it is not, in fact, immune from investigation. And that is an important message to send. All of us in law enforcement who pay attention to the results of these takedowns know that the community is aware. The criminal community is aware when we take these actions. It's important that we do so. It's important that we put the wrongdoers in prison when they deserve it, and it's important for us to put these organizations out of business, and I think we've been able to do that.
Well, that was a very encouraging addition to Mr. Lowery's response. Thank you. I have another question on domestic job creation that I'm going to direct to Ms. Shasky. But before I do, my last question will probably fall right after that, and then we'll introduce our second panel. Take maybe a short recess and introduce our second panel after that. But sometimes I ask a panel that's before us, when we're trying to figure out how to develop some consensus to address a significant challenge to our country. One of the things I'll do, you were very kind to present an opening statement, and I appreciate very much your clear, straightforward responses to the questions I've asked. But I want to ask each of you to take a minute or two maybe to give a closing statement and to reflect on what you said, what others have said, some of the questions that we've asked, and some of what you heard your colleagues on the panel to say. So just be thinking about that. And while they're thinking about that, Ms. Shasky, I'm going to ask you this question about domestic job creation. As you know, there's been some concern that virtual currency businesses might leave the U.S. and move overseas to jurisdictions with a less strict regulatory framework. And what, if anything, can the U.S. do to try to keep businesses in this country? What are we doing that seems to make sense? What maybe more should we do? And along those same lines, is FinCEN engaging with international partners on regulation of virtual currencies? It sounds like we are, but if you could expand on that, I'd be grateful. So those two questions, please.
Sure. So first, in terms of keeping business in the United States, I guess I'd say that if business is going to leave the United States based on perceived or actual regulatory burden, I at least believe that they're going to find that gain short-lived. Every country, as I mentioned earlier, has an interest in protecting its financial system from illicit actors who would launder money or move money on behalf of terrorist organizations, in collecting taxes, and protecting investors, and protecting consumers from fraud, and ensuring a stable economy. And so if this payment system, this virtual currency payment system, system about which we're talking today is going to survive and be a real player, a significant player in the financial system, regulation both at home and abroad is going to catch up because it has to. And so our challenge here is to have smart regulation that both mitigates the risks while at the same time minimizing the burdens. I feel confident that at least in the AML CFT
What does that stand for?
anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing
Thank you.
realm. We have managed to do that and met that challenge. I think that's going to be borne out over time. So I think the innovation and the jobs will stay in the U.S., or at least come back to the U.S. In terms of working with our international partners to ensure that we have a kind of consistent regulatory framework on the anti-money laundering side worldwide, the Financial Action Task Force is the international standard-setting body and does a good job of ensuring that countries around the world have the laws and the regulations in place. My understanding is that they're interested in taking up this issue at the FATF, as it is known. What I can tell you for sure is that my counterparts abroad have been reaching out to us quite a bit to find out what we're doing in this regulatory space. We managed in this country to be able to act a bit quicker than some of our colleagues because we had the broad definitions and were able to fit virtual currency within our pre-existing regime. Germany was able to do the same thing, so they too already have regulations on the books. Other countries are trying to figure out how they can catch up.
All right, thank you. Now, while you think about the answer to this last question we're going to let Mr. Lowery and Ms. Raman go ahead and just give us just a brief closing statement. Ms. Raman, you want to go first?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. It's encouraging from the law enforcement standpoint to have interest in these kinds of issues because they aren't easy. Although we've had many successes, we've clearly had challenges too, and it is helpful when we have interest from people like yourself, and it's helpful when we have questions asked of us like, what can we do to help? There's always something that we can do better, and it's helpful to have these dialogues. I also think it's encouraging that I have colleagues like the ones that are sitting next to me who have been willing to work together on these emerging threats. I think we've all approached it in the same way, which is that virtual currencies in and of themselves are not illegal. We've all recognized that innovation is important, and we've all recognized that, like criminals around have done for ages, this will be another vehicle through which criminals may try to launder proceeds or commit additional crimes. I feel confident that we have the tools that we need to address those threats. I feel confident that we have the will to address those threats, but we need to keep pace with what is going to come, and we will remain vigilant. We intend to be as aggressive in the years to come as we have in the last several years. Virtual currencies didn't just sneak up on us. As I said in my opening statement, we brought our first indictment in 2007. And so we assume that these kinds of threats will continue to emerge and change and evolve, and we intend to keep pace.
All right, thank you. That's a pretty good closing statement. You should do this for a living.
It just so happens I do.
That's good. I think you found the right job. Mr. Lowery.
I would echo those statements.
In fact, I think each of you have.
But in closing, as a DHS law enforcement agency and a longstanding original defender of the U.S. critical infrastructure, I know the Secret Service working with our partners in law enforcement as well as in the prosecution and FinCEN and our international partners will continue to work strategically to remove the gravest threats to our infrastructure. It's going to take consistent awareness of the growing threat. It's going to be, we're going to have to adapt as we always have, and we're going to have to hurdle the international issues and what have you, working together overseas. And I do know U.S. law enforcement is very aggressive and also very collaborative with our foreign partners because we realize that this issue can't be taken care of just by ourselves. We will continue to work as we respond to these threats. We, as a part of DHS, will continue to work to disseminate the threats through DHS and through our electronic crimes task forces, through our various partners, to ensure that the remaining 16 CIKRs throughout for the country's infrastructure are provided the greatest level of protection. And we believe firmly that aggressive law enforcement is a strong part of cybersecurity, which will benefit the nation as a whole.
Thank you. Ms. Shasky, the last word.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I'd like to thank you, as my colleagues did, for convening this very important hearing. You know, I heard a banker, a CEO of a fairly large bank, say recently that having the privilege to be a financial institution and be a part of the global financial system is just that, it's a privilege. And there's a reason why countries and jurisdictions ask you to be licensed to be one of those financial institutions, because it also comes with great responsibility. You have great power in your hands as a part of the financial system, and particularly in this country with the financial system we have in the United States. And so while innovation is a wonderful thing, and innovation in the financial services industry is incredibly important, it does come with obligations to have that entree and be able to be a part of the U.S. financial system. And one of those obligations is helping to protect that system from illicit actors. So we believe that the regulations in place have met that balance of mitigating the risks while minimizing the burden. In essence, we're asking virtual currency exchangers and administrators to do three things. Register with FinCEN. It's an online form and it's free. Put in place AML protections, controls in place to harden yourself to the likelihood that bad actors will take advantage of your system. And maintain records and provide certain reports to FinCEN, including suspicious activity reports. It's something that many other players in the financial system already do, from the smallest mom and pop check casher that's on the corner, probably just up the street here, to the biggest of the global financial institutions. They've all found a way to offer their services while maintaining those same protections. And so that's what we're asking of virtual currency providers. We believe it's reasonable, given that we've seen that virtual currency has, in fact, been exploited by some pretty serious actors. That being said, FinCEN is constantly engaged in outreach to industry and have been engaged in outreach with the virtual currency industry. We try to bring different parts of the industry together so that they can learn from each other the practices, best practices for hardening themselves to illicit finance, and to share the information we collect from them back with them so that they can become even better at protecting the U.S. financial system. So at the end of the day, we hope we have that balance right. We think we have that balance right, but we're committed to continuing the discussions both with industry to see if that's right, as well as our colleagues on the law enforcement side. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a thought-provoking presentation and discussion. It's been encouraging as well. This is probably a stretch of an analogy, but I'm going to try to make it fit. I serve on a committee called Environment and Public Works, and we wrestle all the time with the need to clean up our environment and to put in place a kind of regulatory structure, legislative structure, combination of laws and regulations and enforcement that enable us to breathe the air and drink the water and do so without fear. I always like to say we don't have to make a choice. It's a false choice to say we have to choose between a stronger economy and a clean environment. I think that's a false choice. And one of the questions that's been rattling around in my mind and as we've drilled down on this subject, is it possible to reap the benefits, including the economic benefits of this virtual currency, but at the same time cleaning up the kind of misbehavior, criminal behavior that we all know is out there and is a concern to all of us. And just as I'm become convinced over the years it's possible to have a stronger economy and a cleaner environment. I'm encouraged that maybe it's possible to have the benefits of a virtual currency or virtual currencies, and to actually be able to not facilitate, but to hold down the kind of criminal activity and criminal involvement that we talked about here today. So thank you for giving us both sides of the story. And we're going to have, I suspect, a chance to work with you all some more. And my hope is that you'll feel free to come back and tell us informally or formally where the legislative branch of our government needs to be doing some things to make sure that whatever potential there is here for our economy and for consumers is actually realized. And while we tamp down on that illegal behavior, that criminal behavior, we all want to eliminate. So I'm going to just call just a very short recess while we change up the cards. I'm going to need to take a phone call from one of my colleagues, and we'll probably resume in about 2 minutes. But thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you. Now we'll just take a short recess.